This is a seismic shift from XLS to web app. It's really just a project overview, post-mortem, if you will, discussing a project that we did for Georgia Tech Seismic, which we'll go over that acronym and everything. Hi, my name's Dan. This is me at Drupal Camp, Florida, holding Skywalker the Gator. I've been a Drupal developer for the past 8 years, and I'm currently the lead developer at Savant Group. I'm Aquia certified, if that means anything to you guys. But I've spoken at several past DCATLs, Drupal Camp Florida, Drupal Camp Chattanooga, USG Web Tech Day, DrupalCon Nashville was my last big headline gig. Most recently, I spoke at Drupal Camp Atlanta's mini camp that happened this summer. Big fan of Legos, and also sometimes I can be Batman. And really, I just have to work this photo in every time I do a presentation. So what are we talking about today? As I said, we're doing a post-mortem on a Drupal application that that Savant Group put together. It's going to be a developer's eye view. That's my position on the totem pole. And so you're going to get my perspective on the project. We're going to briefly introduce the project, discuss the workflow that we have internally, which includes the planning stage, the sprints, soft deploy we went through, and then we also had a phase 2 of this project that I'll briefly discuss. And then finally, we'll review outcomes and takeaways, and I'll field any questions that you guys have. So meet the client, CEISMC at Georgia Tech. CEISMC is an acronym that stands for Center for Education Integrating Science, Mathematics, and Computing. If you think that acronym tries really hard, then you're going to see another one in a second that's even worse. But they work to push STEM education for K through 12 education, as well as postgraduate education, so technical schools, colleges. They're really STEM advocates, and that really is designed to not necessarily funnel people to Georgia Tech, but get people more interested in the things that Georgia Tech is interested in. They are the STEM education hype team, basically. Amp It Up is the specific project that our project fell under. And here's where it gets really, really exciting. Advanced manufacturing and prototyping integrated to unlock potential. And that's, they're really, really good with acronyms over there. Amp It Up is really just a curriculum-based program that's designed to introduce engineering concepts to 6th through 9th graders. So it's hyper-focused on that age group and sort of the more advanced science that they're getting into, more of the scientific method that they're trying to apply to experiments and projects that they work on. Our contact point on this entire project was Jeff Rosen. He is a program director at CEISMC, specifically with the Amp It Up program. I've known Jeff Rosen for a very long time. He is actually, he was one of my high school teachers. I was actually part of a magnet program that he helped found and bring together. So he's worked a really long time on trying to get STEM education to be a big part of K through 12 education. He's the man that taught me how to do Flash animation right around the turn of the century. So, so let's meet the project, EDPL. Another acronym stands for Electronic Engineering Design Process Log. This is a large component part of the Amp It Up curricula. It's a tool to help a student engineer keep track of building concepts, putting together different ideas and requirements for that concept, comparing them to each other, eventually prototyping and testing solutions for any identified issue. It's tied, as I said, to that open curriculum. And when I say open, I think you could actually reach out to CEISMC and they will provide you this curriculum, which is kind of nice. But it's really designed to provide a method of applying the scientific method to solving a physical problem, solving an engineering problem. The problem is it's also originally an MS Excel workbook. And I dug deep to find my favorite Microsoft Excel GIF where Kelly Rowland actually is getting text on Excel on her Nokia sideways phone. Very exciting. Let's take a quick look at what the project looks like, old version and new. So I'll drop this out real quick. This is the actual basis of the project. Obviously, you have to turn on macros because it wouldn't do anything cool otherwise. But you have this lovely multi-sheet Excel workbook. The first sheet just lays out the methodology that the entire process is based around. I'll go over these steps briefly because every version of this project follows these steps. It's really the baseline of the curriculum for teaching people about this process. So you'd start out identifying the problem. You'd go to the understanding phase, which you pull together all the requirements and source those out from things like testing feedback or client specification. You ideate, which is a fun verb, but basically brainstorm ideas. You want to make sketches to communicate what those solutions might look like based on those ideas. Then you go forward and evaluate those ideas. Do those designs meet the requirements? What are the strengths and weaknesses of those designs? Are any of them better than any others? And finally, you take that idea and turn it into a prototype, which you can actually test. Once it's tested, you can compare it pretty directly to any other prototype that you've also tested and end up finding what is most likely the best solution for the problem that you're trying to solve. Finally, you've got a nice chunk of output that you just want to put together a big clean document that you can turn into a teacher or some professional. Really, we tried to make it so that that sort of output could be any range on the totem pole. So that's the layout of how the project's supposed to work. You can see that it's pretty basic once you get inside of it. You know, you establish a problem. This is an old doc. And then you set up specific requirements. Need a new doc. And some of these fields get propagated across the entire document once you type in some information. But it's not terribly straightforward. You have the ability to ideate here, which basically lets you drop in an image. You just paste from your desktop or whatever. And then you can add a little bit of information about what that concept is all about. Once you pull over to the evaluation page, it'll cross-reference those concepts with the requirements. And then you say either U, which is unlikely to meet the requirement, or L, if you believe the design is likely to meet the requirement. So say if you have concept A, it's likely to meet the requirement 1. You would just fill in U here, turns it green, or I'm sorry, U means it's not going to happen. So it would turn red. If it would meet requirement 2, you'd say L. Again, it's, it works. You'll end up with a nice red-green sort of layout of all the things that you think about these concepts compared to these requirements, but not terribly straightforward. U and L doesn't make a lot of sense in every context. Finally, you move on to prototype and testing results. You build out a prototype, you drop an image of it in place, let them know what concept you tested, and then based on the requirements, this one's actually passed through from the requirements page. You can list a test that's performed, say whether it meets or exceeds. So again, it turns red or green based on whether or not it actually is able to meet the test. You can list the testing procedures. You could have a bunch of different trials. This page in particular is an awful mess of 4 or 5 different things that need to happen, not necessarily simultaneously. So there's no real good way on this page to order how this works out. And then this final page is really just a place for additional stuff that might not fit on that prototype and test page. So you can see it's a lot of information that can start cropping up pretty quickly, because once you have a concept, once you have a set of requirements, you're going to have X times Y amount of data pouring through the rest of the site on top of tests that you're putting on top of prototypes that you're putting on top of concepts. So an Excel sheet, while it's definitely going to gather all that information, it's not going to do a very complete job. So, I don't want to save that. Let's take a look at what the final product ends up looking like. And I think it's just music, but This is actually put together by a marketing department. We're submitting this for a couple awards just for educational applications. So this goes through what the current version of the system looks like. And this again is going to be all the different sections that I elaborated on in the workflow diagram that we were talking about. So as I said, you'll see these a bunch of times. Sorry. And now that we kind of lay it out for evaluation committees, we can take a look at what it looks like in the application. You got this big drop down that lets you sort of navigate between steps as you need to. There's next and back buttons that let you go through the steps in order. But then it goes through actually creating a project. So you'd identify the project as you would on the original system. Go through and really just say in your own words what you're trying to solve. The understand step is, again, just trying to put together requirements. So you've got the requirements that are automatically dated. You've got options as to where those requirements were sourced from over on the right side. And you can add and remove as many as you need. Ideate, again, lets you put an image and a description of what the concept would actually entail. And for all of these, you know, you can add, remove as many as you need to actually accommodate what you're trying to get done. And you see here, instead of having a U and an L, you get the full word, likely and unlikely, so you know what it means. But there's actually a little modal that pops up, lets you swap what that value is going to be. Prototypes, similar to concepts, you would just upload an image and then sort of reference what concept it is actually testing. And from there, you can take that prototype and start performing tests on it. The tests are built out separately. That's not really shown here, but this is more of what it looks like when you start getting yay or nay values on tests. And then at the end, you get a whole listing of testing results, and just you know, real obvious which result will probably be best. And over the course of the entire project, you're able to throw in research notes, which is something that was desperately lacking from the XLS file. It lets you just explain your process, how you got to where you needed to be. And then you get a lovely PDF output on the back end that just lets all that information come out at the end. So that's where we ended up. And I say ended up, but I'm clear on the understanding that we're still building this. This is, we've had 2 iterations so far. We're getting a lot more traction as time goes on. And so we're going to continue to work with CEISMC at Georgia Tech to build this out. But we want to talk more about what the project actually, how that project lifecycle actually went for us. So let's talk first about what we believe were the project goals. Key goal: move the EEDPL to the web. Check. We're going to put it on Drupal, and the reason is Georgia Tech loves Drupal. Georgia Tech has resources for Drupal. Georgia Tech has support for Drupal. So we're not going to fight for that. There may have been another framework that might have been better off for it, but Drupal was what they knew and what they wanted. So that was sort of locked in at the beginning. Allow for easy administrative oversight. If you had teachers that wanted to actually view the content, the only option before was to send them that file and say, hey, you know, send back any changes you need to. We wanted to implement a system where while everything was online, a teacher or an oversight professional would be able to look at that set of document, monitor changes as they happen in real time, and maybe make comments as needed. This also allows for group access. That means we can get a group of people working on the same project on different machines, as opposed to everyone trying to crowd around the same machine doing the same work. You know, there's only one person who can fit at an entire keyboard. So, and then finally, we wanted to produce that output report. There was a way to export the XLS file to a lovely little bit of output, but We wanted to make it just the click of a button. You get a PDF with all the information that you provided. So specifically about the project workflow, let's talk about what went into the planning. We had our initial meeting. The client discussed how the EDPL worked now and the changes they wanted to see, went over everything that I've already discussed with you guys. The nicest thing about that initial meeting was that all stakeholders were present. That means the client leads, everybody that was invested on the client side was there, project management was there, I, the developer, was there, lead developer was there, and the designer was even available. Having everybody in the room at the same time let us reach decisions about things that we could not otherwise reach without significant deliberation over a long period of time. So it was very nice to have, right up front, everybody in the same room at the same time talking about the same thing. It also allowed us to proceed on multiple fronts from the outset. Designer can start layouts, DevOps can build environments, developer maps out the system, project manager can get whatever resources anybody else needs to sort of do the job. Since I'm a developer, and since I said this talk is basically a developer's perspective, I want to talk a little bit about what planning went into the data model. Each step in the EDPL, as it's sort of been demonstrated to you guys, maps pretty conveniently to nodes of different content types. So some steps require, just a little line of information like the requirements, whereas tests might require a whole bunch of information about how that test is meant to be conducted. But each one of those steps is pretty closely mapped to a content type. I mentioned here, some steps are made up of multiple entities of a content type taken together. Requirements is a good example of that, where each requirement listed on that page is not a field on a requirements node, but is instead its own requirements node. They're just all sort of grouped together to the project in general. So when I built this out, when I built out the data model, I was actually really, really proud of how complete a job we did getting it on paper. So I wanted to sort of outline what the components of this of the model tickets were and how each one sort of contributes to getting that model correct. Name and outline the purpose of the entity. You want to give it a name. People talk about in computer sciences, putting a name on something is a lot of times the hardest thing you can do. So get it done first thing so you don't have to worry about it. I say that, but over the course of this project, I think the core content type actually changed names 2 or 3 times from project to problem and then back again. So it's nice to have the name out front, but not necessarily required. Second, you want to give information about the expected entity architecture. I thought at the beginning some of these were going to be paragraphs, but they all ended up being node content types. So that's, again, not always used. You're not always using the information that you get at the beginning, but it's always good to have a plan from the outset. And then you go in and outline the fields. Give all the information that you can, give the field type, give the cardinality, give the requirements. And then just notes and related features that are specific to that entity or content type. The idea here is this is pseudocode for your data model. You want to make sure that everything you can is pumped into this description so that whoever comes behind you to actually build it out, or whoever comes behind you to document it, can look at this and refer to it and say, oh, this is how this is supposed to work, and this is probably why. Development planning for the features is a little bit different. Obviously, they're not quite as rigorous into how tight the data structure is, but at the same time, you need to have a good enough concept to get off the ground and get going. The key component feature for the EDPL project was the overall workflow. Client specified drop-down and previous next navigation, but outside of styling was left largely at the discretion of the implementing developer. This was kind of an issue later on, but we'll get to that. Another major component was the output PDF. If you've seen my talks in the past, I've literally given the class on doing PDFs in Drupal, so that was a solved problem in our case. So it was more of a styling challenge than anything else. And then the other major feature was oversight access, which is just going to be different account levels and their ability to access different components of the site. We discussed it with clients and documents, but most of all, this was relegated to phase 2. And again, we'll talk about that once I reach that point. So I, as a lead developer, decided that I did a good enough job documenting things that I could pass this along to an outsourced developer, save a couple ducats, and eventually get a product that we liked. Unfortunately, that's not quite what happened. The outsourced development was actually where it sort of started going a little sideways, and you sort of started doing this a lot. The contractor that we onboarded for the project was someone that we'd actually worked with before. It had a very positive experience with before. They were initially contracted for just a 2-week sprint to try to get all the entities in place and start doing layout and maybe even build the features if they're able. Early communication was excellent. We still like this guy. If he was still around, we would still use him. But the problem started pretty early on. The deviation from recommended documented architecture happened within probably the first 2 or 3 days. He looked at what I had put in place and said, this is good. I need to change it here, here, and here. It started with a well-reasoned swap from paragraphs to field collections. We're building this out in Drupal 7, so paragraphs didn't have the revision support that we needed, but field collections did. Maybe field groups. I think it's field collections. But then it ended up becoming, it bloated. And the changes that ended up happening to the data model and the original plan ended up being a fully customized table implementation that did its own free-range thing with how relationships between projects, the main project node and the component project nodes were related, with a whole set of custom functions that were built around it. The custom architecture obviously complicated the project, which means the timeline on the project got longer, the budget for the contract labor got tapped, and finally, by the time the contractor leaves and isn't working on the project anymore, we've got 90 to 95% of the site built, and it's on some pretty shaky foundations. The biggest issue here was contractor management, not the contractor. The contractor, I believe in all good faith, did an excellent job, did it to the best of their abilities. The issue that actually came up was that I was not applying the correct amount of pressure for this contractor to stick to the initial plan and to sort of stay the course. Some of the major issues that we had were I was too focused on overly explicit communication. This contractor came on board and wasn't updating tickets as regularly as I wanted and wasn't providing information as often as I wanted. And I made it a mission to make sure this guy was going to give me every scrap of information I needed so that I could have my reports to my superiors, the project manager and the owner of the company, so I could let them know what's going on. So I spent a lot of time trying to get them in sort of a template, and that shouldn't have been what I was doing. The focus should have been on code pushes and trying to get the actual work completed from him, particularly while we were still in good communication at the beginning of this project. I was also too flexible on implementation details. You'll notice I'm saying I here. Since I was the lead developer, this is ultimately my responsibility, so I'm internalizing, taking personal responsibility here. I was too flexible on implementation details. I actually caught several bad implementations and noted that, hey, this is probably not the way I wanted to go with this. But then the contractor would come back and say, I had a superior on my end tell me that was a bad idea, or, well, just wait and see how this is going to look. So I ended up allowing them to proceed in certain instances in good faith on the basis that I would evaluate their completed results and figure out what to do from there. Usually this would happen because they were kind of halfway into that solution already. The problem is a bad implementation is still bad, even when someone works on it for a couple more days. So what needed to happen was I needed to rigidly conform to no solutions to prevent wasted time and flawed code. Here's a good example from our Slack channel of what it looks like when your lead makes a bad choice. So he's come to me with a solution. In this particular instance, he said something along the lines of, well, I don't want to use entity reference. It's got a lot of overhead. So I'm just going to build a lightweight table solution and then move forward from there. And I catch it. I say I disagree. It sounds significantly like more custom code to rebuild the functionality, and doesn't have the documentation to support that entity field query would provide for entity references. But he elaborates a little bit more. He says, well, I don't know. This guy on my side told me that I respect told me that he, it's just too much overhead. And by this point, it's clear he's put effort into the solution already, and so I let it happen. I make the mistake of letting it slide. So I say, go ahead, build it out the way you're planning. Can't evaluate it without seeing it anyways, so go for it. Let's see what falls out the end. Don't do that. It's a bad idea. It's a waste of time. If you've got a solution that works, and you spent time planning that solution, there's got to be better justifications he's got to come to the table with before you should let that go. So, he did not like. I think he was resistant to using entity field query specifically, and instead wanted to use just regular queries, like flat queries, not even dynamic queries, just select statements that were typed out. And I guess that's just a resistance that they had internally in their shop. It would be faster in some instances because even the dynamic queries add a little bit of overhead because they have to process that, but not so much faster that it would have made the system better. Yeah, exactly. So cleaning up the mess. We still have a deadline and MVP to complete. So the idea is to wrap it up. Attack the worst bits of the implementation. I removed field groups that created an extra layer of abstraction. I noted earlier that requirements were actually set up one requirement node as each requirement. In the implementation that I received back from the contractor, it was actually one requirement node, and you had a big set of field groups or field collections, and each one of those was a different requirement, which means there's a whole extra node in between you and the data you need to get to when referencing requirements. That's obviously a problem that needed to be nixed. Got rid of it. I also ended up having to complete the implementation of the PDF output that didn't fit into his contract any longer because all this custom code stretched out all the work he was doing, and it no longer fit into the contract that we had with him. And then finally, because we needed to cross that finish line, I ended up shoring up the custom code implementation for now. Now, there's a good reason I did not just call the project and say, hey, this is something we're going to have to sit on and work on until it's correct. And the reason is because I knew we had additional phases of the project upcoming. Had there not been more phases down the line, I would have probably pumped the brakes really hard and said, this is something we need to fix now before this product ever goes live or gets launched or anything like that. And here I am crossing the finish line. Woo! So, soft deploy. Limited release to a single institution. We're satisfied that release is feature complete. We got everything done. It's not perfect, but it is complete. The client's happy with the MVP that they have built out. Let's bring a few classes of students in to test. And this, of course, is a representative number of a few classes worth of students in the entire high school musical cast. So lots of small details that students noticed almost immediately. It's surprising what a sixth grader could find in a website and let you know about buttons being slightly off, triggers and events not working correctly. A lot of those got really quickly resolved. We did encounter a couple major issues though. One was that registration was far too complex. The registration system in Drupal, we were using the default registration system in Drupal, which relied on students creating accounts and the teachers coming back and approving those accounts. That led to a big mess of just emails flying all over the place. The biggest problem with that is that when students are at school, there's a good chance they can't access their emails. whether they're missing their phones, don't have phones, can't log into Gmail from a school-based network. Emails were just not going to cut it for how this registration was going to work. On top of that, we also had email system failures. It started with our emails getting caught in spam folders. We implemented something to prevent that, which I'll talk about in just a second. But once we implemented that, the email provider actually had spam protection. So what happens is a classroom of 20 kids comes in to use this for the day. All of a sudden, all 20 of them has to register and get signed in at the same time. So that's 20 emails to them just about passwords. And then the teacher has to come back and do 20 emails back to them about how, oh, your registration has been approved. And then there's another email that fits into the mix. So 60 emails in the matter of 5-10 minutes. All of a sudden, our email provider is like, whoa, and decided to shut down the entire email system for a good hour before they let us back on. So 3 emails to complete was obviously one of the major key problems. So having done our soft deploy, having done, sort of trial by fire testing for a small group of students, we entered into phase 2 with a good idea of what needed to be fixed, what needed to be changed. So we started by solving the issues in the soft deploy. We moved the mail service to a third-party provider Mailgun. If you've not used Mailgun, very effective way to improve your logging. It also does better reporting on issues. And the biggest thing for us was that our registration emails were hitting spam folders because of the domain we chose for the production environment. Mailgun is more of a trusted email provider, so that gave us sort of instant credibility to keep us out of email spam folders. We also implemented an email-free account creation workflow. You've probably seen this on some sites. It's not my favorite thing because at the end of the day, for students to recover passwords and things like that, we do ultimately have to collect their email. But we actually implemented a system that uses a join code to verify you as a student. It also takes that join code and uses it to place you into the classroom that you are a part of, which is very handy. It's a custom solution, but it wasn't too exotic. Really, the idea was that when, the user was created, we would create a random email, and then just don't show that email to that person when they go to edit their profile. Once they have an actual email on their profile, that essentially flags the system to say that, oh, hey, we do password resets. Oh, hey, this person actually has an email set. Show it to them on the user profile edit screen. And then expanding functionality and fixing past mistakes. The application, now that we'd done our small test group, was expanding. We needed an architecture that would support school districts and classes on top of projects. So an additional layer of groupings and architecture on top of the project system that we already had in place. All of these different teams need to be private from one another. In addition, we also still wanted to tackle removing the custom relationship tracking for component nodes, your requirements, your projects, your requirements and your tests, your prototypes, that sort of thing, joining back to the main project node. Entity reference originally was our solution to that. It seemed like an obvious choice. There's a lot of support, lets you use entity field query pretty easily, but entity reference couldn't retrieve related data without creating custom functions. So we'd have to write queries for all that stuff. And we'd basically be doing the same thing that the custom implementation was already doing. So we had several problems and we reached one solution: organic groups. It really saved the day. We initially did not consider organic groups for this implementation because we wrote it off as a social solution. When you start talking to people about organic groups in Drupal, they talk about forums. They talk about, oh, this is how social media would look if you were going to implement it with Drupal. But it's really more basic than that. If you don't know anything about organic groups, it's basically the ability to take a node of any type and then attach nodes to it of any other type. You could set limits on what types of nodes or users even are attached to that group node. And in that way, you can sort of build an architecture of forums or friend groups and social media environments, or in our particular case, all the different classes within schools, within districts that we needed to put together. OG carried that model very well. It was a bit of a paradigm shift to look at OG in that way, but once we did, we realized this is actually solving a lot of problems. And hey, aren't projects just component nodes that are attached to a single group node? So we ended up taking the entire project model backend that had the custom solution and changing that into an OG-based model. It took a lot of re-engineering to get that old code out, but having a module that's got a support base, that has a resource base, that people recognize and are able to support is incredibly useful moving forward with this project. We did end up having to do a lot of custom code to sort of make OG fit the application that we had, but not nearly to the scope that we had for projects in the past. It included things like making groups that are always going to be private, non-optional private groups, and implementing that join code functionality that we talked about that would automatically join users to groups. So where are we now? As of the beginning of October, the application had over 1,000 projects on it. It was being used by over 1,300 students and teachers. I think we're in 7 or 8 districts across the country, looking to expand much further as we move into more semesters down the line. CEISMC is expanding in new districts all the time, and development's going to continue on the EDPL system. So key takeaways. The focus of contract work is the work. If I'm spending time trying to get somebody to respond properly and inform me in ways that I have expectations about, but they don't, they're not using that time to elicit the response that I want, is time that they're not spending on getting the work done. And time that I'm spending being anxious about stuff that I don't need to be anxious about. I should be focused on the work. They should be focused on the work. The work is the work. Trust and lean on what you planned. People are going to want to make changes, but they need to be justified changes. So when someone comes to you to say, this is an alternative way of doing this, well, why do we want to do that? Why do we want to change what we have established? This is what we can support. Is this something that you'll be able to support or document to the ability of supporting down the line? And then finally, the concept of somebody's already built this. Just because organic groups didn't look like initially what we thought our data model was going to be, doesn't mean it didn't fit the solution. It just meant that my paradigm had to shift and look at organic groups in such a way that it actually would work correctly for what we wanted. All right, that's about it as far as going over our workflow process for this project. I could dip into the application a little bit, but you wouldn't probably see much more than you've already seen in the video. So are there any questions? All right. Well, thank you guys for coming to the talk, and I appreciate it. I see the crowd ballooned. But I'm just glad to have people that want to hear me talk. Thank you so much.